Дорогие коллеги, спасибо за ваш интерес, спасибо, что вы пришли сегодня на этот семинар. И я хотел бы представить вам нашего гостя из Франции, из Французского национального института демографических исследований. Это один из самых известных демографов, доктор Жак Валин, который сделал для демографии очень-очень много. Если бы я сейчас начал это говорить, я бы до завтра не кончил. Вот. Но сегодня он расскажет свои мысли о демографических процессах, которые сейчас происходят в современном мире, и что нам ожидать от будущего. Доктор Валин приехал сюда, чтобы помочь нам, Центру новому демографических исследований, который открыт в рамках РЭШ, при проведении курса для слушателей из России и из других государств сопредельных по продолжительности жизни, по населению и здоровью. И он в рамках этого курса тоже прочитал замечательную лекцию, провел семинары и принес много пользы. Вот. Ну, спасибо вам за то, что пришли, и предоставляю слово доктору Жаку Валину.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. It's a great pleasure for me to be there with you today, and I hope that you could follow what I will say. But I see that if I'm not enough interesting, you have ping pong, and you can play ping pong instead of listen to me. I have to talk about the end of the demographic transition with a question mark, theory and reality. In 1870, France was defeated by Prussians, and it lost its very beautiful provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, and the French public opinion was overrun by a great fear, the fear of the decline. And the culprit was very soon identified. It was the lack of population. Indeed, France was in the past the most populated country of Europe, and perhaps it is because of that Napoleon came to Moscow, I don't know. But in fact, for many decades after that, France had a very, very slow population increase, while its neighboring, Germany, Prussia at the time, Italy, United Kingdom, grown very fast demographically. And due to this depressive opinion, somebody like Jacques Vallin said in 1896, he said the Alliance nationale pour la croissance de la population, National League for the population growth. And even later, after the World War I, and another decade of very low fertility in France, the Alliance turned the name to the Alliance for, no, the Alliance Nationale contre la dépopulation, the League against depopulation. Another time, another fear At the end of the 50s, the United Nations published their first world population prospects and announced that the world population will reach 6 billion in the year 2000. It was a bomb. And a new fear appears, and a new culprit too. And now the culprit was the poor population of the poor countries, and their bad idea to have so high fertility rates. José de Castro wrote at that time that the bed of misery is fertile. He was wrong, of course, because his biological theory was completely false. But it was exactly the idea of the time. And this passed the way of rather xenophobic fantasies, but also the cult of the demographic growth zero, economic growth zero, and even among ecologists, people who are getting more and more influence, the idea that we would be so much more happy if the planet could have only a few billion people. A few hundred of million, not billion people. So there are two very contradictory fears, but these fears were running on very true facts, which were also in the opposite direction. And it was necessary to get some explanation of that, to be less afraid. And the explanation came first from Adolphe Landry in France, with his theory of the demographic revolution. This was in the late 30s, just before World War II. And after World War II, and after this population explosion in the Third World, the American, like Kingsley Davis or Frank Notenstein, and so on, rename the theory as a demographic transition, but also gave to this theory, gave to the historical process with this theory an end. And the end will be when all population of the world will recover low population growth rate. And then the demographic transition could then, that time, explain both the French depressive demographic situation in the beginning of 20th century, and also the world population explosion. And the latter having an hand, we were satisfied with that and less afraid, and the stabilization of the world population will be profiled for the year 2050 about, perhaps a little bit more, at an amount of about 10 billions, which was much lower than people expected after the 6 billion announced by the United Nations, and extrapolated, it was possible to have billions and billions and dozens of billions and so on. But now we are more quiet. It's a great relief, but also there are still reason to worry. And I would like to emphasize with you there's three reasons to worry about population trends right now. And I will examine 3 points. The first is that the last phase, what we are living now, the last phase of the demographic transition is also a period of sharpening disequilibrium. Second is at the end of the transition, the end, like that, because what is new. But the end of the transition is not the end of its consequences. And the third is that the accomplishment of the theory is less the end of the historical process than the death of the explanatory paradigm. First, the last phase of the demographic transition is also a period of sharpening disequilibrium. To go there, I'm sorry for that because my first point will be a little bit long. But I think that to go there, I have to summarize for you the full story. And start to make the point that it was a very, very big shock when the United Nations announced 6 billion. Because if you take the second half of the 20th century, and more precisely, from the year 1950 to the year 1947, it is less than 40 years, the world population went from 2.5 billion to 5 billion, doubling in 40 years. If you admit, we can make some rough assumptions, that the current human species appeared in the Earth about 100,000 years before Christ. It's about approximately Homo sapiens appearance. If you also admit, this is more fabulous, but that it begins with Adam and Eve, so population, world population at the time was 2 people. Now we have 6 billion in 2000, 6 billion, or 5 million in 1987. So, do you know how many doubling is needed to come from 2 people to single people until 6 billion, until 5 billion? Have you any idea? Any mathematician can do that very fast, but I cannot. But I have it here. It is only 31 doubling. 31 doubling for a period of about 100,000 years. So it means about 3,000 or more by average for each doubling. It means that for millenniums and millenniums, human population had at least 3,000 years before they see the population double. This is the time for having, for example, the very renowned civilization of antique Egypt, born, then grew, and then disappear. Now, at the end of the 20th century, only 40 years, not enough to have a man or a woman born, growing, and not disappear. 40 is very young. So you can see the difference, you can see the change, and it was a very big change. And if we could, if we look at arithmetical scale, it's always fantastic, of course, but I cannot resist to the pleasure to show you that. So 1950, we were there, and suddenly, 2000, we will be there. And then we have still 2010, 2050, and 2100. So, as you see here, everything finally started in the mid-18th century about. In the mid-18th century in Europe. And then it will expand to the other countries of the world. But first, in the mid-18th century in Europe, what happened? It happened there, you know it very well probably, that mortality, before I say that, during all the millennium before, there was a very fragile equilibrium between high mortality, high fertility, because it was necessary to have at least 5, 6, 7 children by woman to be able to balance the very high infant mortality, especially the life expectancy was about 25, 30 years only. And very fragile equilibrium and very, very fluctuating indicators, even for mortality and for fertility. And in the total, a very, very slow increase. And in fact, increase of human population at the time was only the fact of that population spread out around the planet to get new space to be able to live. Once, in this very far past, once there were already some demographic revolution. It was at the time of Neolithic, because at the time Neolithic, it was also the discovery of agriculture, and it gave more possibility for people to eat in a smaller space. And the population of the world seemed, of estimation of course, seemed to have grown at this time by 10 times, from about the 5th millennium before Christus to the 4th millennium. The population, world total population, was passed from 15 million to 150 million. So multiplication by 10. It's a strong one. But in fact it was during 1,000 years, and the pace of the growth were not negligible, but very slow. From the beginning, from the mid-18th century, things are changing completely, because a new cause of population increase appeared. It is that human, at last, finally, become able to fight with some efficiency the disease and the death. And then mortality decreased and opened the door for an increase of the population. Of course, you know very well that after that, fertility will follow, because with the decrease of mortality, it becomes unnecessary to have so many children to balance the mortality. And at the end, it is enough to have 2 children per woman to balance the things. But the problem is that the decrease of mortality came before, generally, there are exceptions, but generally before the decrease of fertility. Why? Because as soon as you have means to fight against disease, against death, everybody agrees, and you do it. But to have the balance on the fertility side, you need first to perceive the change. And the change is not so immediate to see. In particular at the level of families, small families, couples. They are not perception, immediate perception that mortality is decreasing. When people perceive that, and when they see that their children survive, so they get some new idea, but not yet the idea to control the fertility, because for millenniums, the humans were used to make it possible to have so many, as many children as possible to counterbalance and the rule of the society, the rule of the religions were fixed with that, having a lot of babies. And so you have to transgress the laws to be able to control your fertility. And this comes with time. And the reason why there is some big increase of the population during some time. And I can show you here a graph about the demographic transition in England. And this graph is interesting because England is something as the archetype of the demographic transition in Europe. And you see here the decrease in mortality. You see mortality is still fluctuating, but decreasing rather rapidly. But if you look at this is a mortality rate, you look at the fertility, the birth rate, not only it does not decrease immediately, but even it increased first. And this is sometimes surprising. It is not the case everywhere, but very many times it is like that. Even in the it's like that. And it is because with the modernization of the society, the role of the woman also changed. And especially with the industrialization, the involvement of the woman in factories, in many places of work, which are not only rural, provoke some change in the behavior in terms of breastfeeding. Simply that. Breastfeeding decrease in terms of length of breastfeeding. And if you decrease breastfeeding length, you open the door for more babies, because the breastfeeding is something which gives a temporary unfecundity to women. So there is some increase, and then stagnation of birth rate in England. And the decline in birth rate comes only 1 century and more after the beginning of the mortality decline. And during all that period, there is a big change in terms of natural growth of the population. And you see here for England, we have a century, about a century of rapid population growth. About 1.5% per year. And this is unprecedented, because if you compare that to the Neolithic period I mentioned before, its Neolithic growth was nothing. It was about 0.2, and now we have, at the mean range of course, and now we have 1.5. So the population growth in England was very fast at the time. And England, but not only England, European population grew fast, except France. But this is a special case that we could discuss later if you want. But European growth was fast, and the European balance in the European share in the total population of the world also grew fast, because the other countries of the world did not grow, not grow very, very slowly as in the past. And so the share of the Europe in terms of demographic was growing. And relying on this dynamism of the European demography, but also on the strong economic situation of Europe, and also, we have to say that, on guns and weapons, Europe invaded the rest of the world, either by colonization or by just taking the territories. And Europe dominated the world. At the end of the middle of the 19th century, already Europe dominated the world. And at the beginning of this movement of domination of the world by Europe, the situation for the dominated country was very, very difficult, very drastic, even in terms of demography. This is a bit longer story, but you can think of slavery in Africa, you can think of many things in Latin America and so on. But with time, especially starting with the 20th century, but even more after World War II, this influence of Europe was also benefited to the rest of the world, because Europe already gets the tools for fighting against disease, fighting against the death, and these tools were exported to the rest of the world. Even if among these tools we also imported ourselves some tools from China, for example. But let us be frank. So, in the second stage of this domination of the world by Europe, it provokes a change in what we called at this time the Third World. A big change. A big change because the mortality in these countries will decline even more rapidly than in Europe. And the decline was so rapid, for example, in some countries, especially after World War II, in Sri Lanka, for example, or in Mexico, in 10 years of calendar, the countries gained as many years of life expectancy as Sweden gained in 150 years. So there is a very, very rapid decrease in mortality in the Third World. And, as in Europe, of course, the fertility balancing is yet to come. It is not immediate. And even if it is only some decades, when you have this big decrease in mortality and stagnation, or even some increase in fertility, even if it is for a very short period, you get for that short period more population growth rate of 3%, even sometimes 4%. So a veritable, very, very fast growth of population. And this is the explanation for the 6 billion predicted by the United Nations in the late 50s for the total population of the world. And it was a big fight at that moment between the neo-Malthusian people who wanted to have this country very rapidly adopting population control, population fertility control. And the other, the anti-Malthusians, who wanted to let the thing go, and you shall see that it will be the same. But the fight was not finished, that we saw that effectively it's approximately the same, whatever the policy. And everywhere, fertility starts to decline, even in sub-Saharan Africa, where people said that, oh, it never happened in that region because you cannot control their fertility. Yes, they did, and without much policies. But they did. And so, the demographic transition theory was applied. And if the demographic transition applies, we can make good perspective, good population prospect for the future without being too afraid to be wrong. And the reason why in the late 50s the United Nations stopped the projection at 2000 was not that they cannot go further, they could, but the assumptions would have been so different, would have had so different consequences that it would be a mess, because they were obliged to propose very, very divergent assumptions with for the high option, with some figures who cause even more and greater fear than it was at the moment. So they didn't do that. But starting with the end of the 70s, they made population projection for later period, and until 2050 first, and then until 2100, and with a rather big confidence in the results. And the situation was now that in the 2050 world population would be about 9.3 or 0.5 billion, and perhaps there will be a stabilization at the horizon of 2100. So it is the end of the transition, and everybody is relaxed. But problems are still there. Some problems are still there. Indeed, you can say that when you are in 2010, you can say that, oh, no, it's nothing. We have already done the most difficult, and it is rather true, some appearance, because from, if you think of the past 40 years, the next 40 years, in the past 40 years, 1970 to 2010, we passed from 3.7 billion to 6.9 billion. It means 3.2 more, or 100% more. So we made a jump of 100%, which is a lot. But if you look at the next 4 decades, 2010-2050, it will be a growth from 6.9 to 9.3, which is 2.4, but the initial 6.9 are more. So the percentage is only 35%. If we were able to grow by 100%, we can grow by 35%. It is not a big matter. Yes, but the things are more complicated than that. Because today, one important fact, today, about 20% of the world population benefit of 75% of the gross domestic product of the world, GDP. And 80% of the less rich population have only the rest, 25%. And this is a mass, of course. And even inside, there's 25%, then 80% of less rich population. There are big inequalities. And so there is some population who are still very, very poor, and they are not so low populated, but even more, they are growing at a very fast rate again. So look at this map. This map you can understand them very well. You have a description of the world by country, with country represented by a surface which is proportional to the population. But this, not to fix precisely this map, but just to look at the change. This was the situation in the 1950. Here is 2000. You see the difference. And tomorrow will be 2050. We will have that. And so you have, when you pass from this one to the last, you see the declining share of Europe, but also you see the very big increase in the share of Africa. So there is still, and this is still ahead. So we have still a source of disequilibrium between the countries in terms of demographic situation. But you can also look at this graph, which is the trends, the population trends already done, and prospect by United Nations for the world total population. You can see that in this world, the developed countries here are completely stagnating. So they are more and more rich, but not increasing their population. Here you have the less developing world, less developing countries, the normal terminology of the United Nations. And you can see that there is still an increase, important, until the 2050, but then a stabilization. But now, more and more, the United Nations made a distinction between the least developed countries and inside the less developed countries. And if you take the less developed countries without the list, you have that, and you can see that the increase, the next increase is not so much, and there will be some decrease after that. But if you look at the least developed countries here, you have a steady increase for long. So, it means that for some part of the population, the world population, and the poorest part of the population, there will be necessary for them to welcome again 100% more population. So it's a big challenge for them, and they are in the worst situation. And I think that my first conclusion is that at this last step of the demographic transition, it would be very urgent to seriously do what we always said that we shall do, but without never doing it. It is to help economic development of the poorest countries. This is a very, very urgent task for everybody in the world. But the end of the transition, the end of the demographic transition, is not yet there. It is only announced, and it is far from to have been faced. But it is not all. We have a second point, which is the end of the transition is not the end of its consequences. Oh, sorry. But first, in fact, what is the end of the transition? What is it? Really, I don't know. Is it the moment when the TFR, the total fertility rate, is reaching 2.1, the level of the strict replacement of generation? If yes, well, we are not far from there, even at the world scale. But you know that when you reach this rate, it is not necessarily obvious that you stop the population growth. There is in any population, according to its age structure, there is some potential for growth. And the potential depends, of course, on the structure. And if you take countries like sub-Saharan African countries, where the level of fertility is still rather high, and you decide that tomorrow morning all this population will have 2.1 per woman, in spite of that, the population will grow by 60% before stabilizing. And even China, where the fertility rate is now very low, almost at that point, but if it comes at that point, or still stay at that point, it will be again 50% growth before the stabilization. So there is some problem there. So probably 2.1 children by woman is not exactly the end of the transition. Is it when the population growth is zero? Yes, it is the case if we think that only the rapid population growth matters. But in fact, demographic transition is not only a question of population growth. It is also, and it was implicitly said before, it is also a change in the age structure of the population. And when the transition occurs, you will have big change in the structure and even bigger change for the future. And in terms of age structure, of course, that we can also think of many other things like urbanization and so on. But let us take only age structure because I already speak a lot. Look at this graph. This is the trends for France, for China, of the share of population age of 60 plus. And you can see that in France, there is a trend for centuries. The trends getting up with time. But we have, in straight line, we have the estimate for the past, and after that, the projection by the United Nations. And you see that the trends for France is going up, but the trends for China will go up much rapidly. And France get 20% population above 60. Oh, sorry. About here, and it was 10% here, but you see that we had about 150 years to adapt our country to this new situation. But if you look at China, you see here, 20% is there, And, sorry, and in very, very few number of years, 25 years exactly, it will reach 20%. So China has to assume in 25 years what we assume, or not assume, because we didn't do the thing very well, during 150 years. And then, again, for the future, the France will go up still until 30%, but China much faster. You can have some, perhaps some question mark about the fact that we are passing over this line. This line is the result for a stabilized population with 2.1 children per woman and maximum life expectancy of 85 years. But the United Nations now thinks that things could be different in the future. For China, it is obvious that there is some increase, very high, and then some return. But even for France, you see some increase here, because the hypotheses are not exactly that one. But you can see here that in the case of a stabilization with an idealistic condition of life expectancy and birth rate as we thought in the some past, we get that result. 30% population above 60 plus. So we have to adapt to that sort of thing, and this is, even for European countries, is still ahead for us. And it is ahead for the developing countries, of course, but with much more difficulties in that country. And the surprise when this will happen in these countries with very rapid demographic change, the new change in terms of structure will be very sharp and very, very surprising if you don't pay attention to it before. Because for a while, and we are exactly there in China, for example, you have a very wonderful age pyramid for economic development, because you have no more a lot of children, not yet a lot of old people, so you have a big proportion of active population in active ages. So the problem is to make active this population who are at active ages. And it is very important to do it and to prepare the following, because the following is increasing in the proportion of old people, which will be much faster than it has ever been in the European countries. But this is not the most, perhaps not the most problematic, because, and this is my third point, the accomplishment of the theory is less the end of the historical process than the death of the explanatory paradigm. The theory was beautiful. It promised us to go towards a perfect equilibrium between the highest possible life expectancy, which was estimated to 85 years until recently. So the maximum possible life expectancy and the strict necessary number of children by woman. It will be an era of complete stability and even the application of what demographers call the population, the stationary population, population where nothing changed, not the number, not the structure. So it would be very comfortable for everybody, of course, and it was the promise of this theory. But how could we have, no, could we, how could, I'm sorry, how could we have let them, ourselves think that as a life expectancy will reach a limit and stay there forever? And how could we be able to believe, I'm sorry to my words in English, how they are, to believe that the total fertility rate will stop to change when we arrive at 2.1 per woman? Why? But we believed on that for long, and it was not very good. But if everyone from this point of view, the theory fails now. Not only because we have some big trouble in Africa with AIDS, not only because in your country and in countries like Russia, at the east of Europe, we had a big crisis in health system and in the demographic, the life expectancy trends. But mainly because on the reverse, life expectancy, in fact, seems to have to increase more than we expected. And also because TFR is going down very, very low now in many countries. And you are in that situation in Russia, but you are not alone. In many countries, fertility rate is below 2, and even in developing countries, even in countries like North Korea, South Korea, or like Hong Kong, or like Singapore, and so on, there is population with much less than 2 children per woman. And both, of course, have consequences for population growth and structure of charge. First of all, it is necessary because life expectancies in matters. It is important to understand that whatever the life expectancy above 80 years old, whatever the life expectancy, it will be necessary to have 2.1 children to have at the end the equilibrium. But nowadays, assuming trends for the future is a very big challenge. And I would like to show you something about that to perhaps understand a bit well. Let us see this graph. The red points are the estimation of world population for the year 2000 in each of the successive population prospects of the United Nations since the end of the 50s. And you see that at the level of the world, it seems that the first proposal by the United Nations was quite the good one. And there were some corrections sometimes, but not many. And in fact, we went very smoothly to the result, with very good prognostic from the beginning. And this is why. This is because we have the theory of demographic transition in hand. And this is more obvious if you look at that case, because the main problem at the moment was the population of the third world. And if you look at the less developed countries, the success of the United Nations works is even better. It is almost a straight line, the red points. But if you look at the more developed countries, the United Nations was not able to make the good estimation from the beginning. And they had to correct their estimation very drastically, at least twice in this graph. And the result, the true result in 2000 was 20-25% less than the prognostic from the beginning. And now, you imagine that we are in that situation where the United Nations were in the 1950 for the developed countries. We are in the situation for all the countries, for the world. So it's difficult to make good prognostic for the next decade. And indeed, if you look at this projection made in 2010 by the United Nations, you have, of course, you have the medium hypothesis, and I rely on it for what I said before. But if you want to be honest, you have to consider the high and the low as rather possible. And the difference is very big between 6 billion, less than 6 billion, so we go back, or more than, no, not more, but or 16 billion, which is almost 3 times. So we are in a very big, difficult situation to be able to make any population prospects. And I can insist a little bit more, because even there's hypotheses for this graph are rather smooth, rather sweet, rather timid. And you can imagine many other scenarios. And I would like to, if I have still time or not, can go further a little bit. So, I would like to propose you some extreme assumptions and look rapidly to their consequences. First, we can make assumptions about fertility, which would be very different from the United Nations assumption, but not so far from what is perhaps possible for the future. First, you could imagine one-child perspective. This is the policy of China. They would like to have one child, but perhaps now they are changing, but not yet much. Or it is also the real situation of many populations, of subpopulations around the world now. Another type of hypothesis is to change the age at childbearing. This is more audacious, probably, but it is not so impossible with the perspective recently tried in some countries to have children very late. For women, of course. For men, it is not a problem. For women. And let us see what happens if we pass from 30 to 50 for the mean age at childbearing. And another field for strong hypothesis is the field of mortality, of course. And we know very well now that the 85-year limit is certainly not true. Some countries are already there and perhaps beyond. But we can overpass the limit, but in what extent and when, we don't know. And here I have the extreme hypothesis to have 150 life expectancy in 100 years. So what are the reasons for that? If you look at the first scenario, TFR 1 child, and life expectancy 85. The total population will decrease, of course. And in fact, after 200 years, the world population would be only 200 million. And probably, surely, in the future it will disappear. But also, there will be a big change in age structure. We will pass to, can emphasize about old population. At 60 plus, we will have 56% instead of 30%. Second scenario, TFR is 2.1, okay? But the mid-age children goes to 50, and life expectancy is still 85. At the end, the age structure will be the same as in normal projection, with 24% young, 46% adult, and 30% old. But it will be first a sharp decrease in the population, because you see, in such situation, you will have at one moment of the projection, we will have zero TFR, zero. You can have TFR zero, depending on the hypothesis, of course, but you will have a time when some women are already their boys, their girls, and the next one are not yet started. So it can be zero. In any case, it will be very, very low for a while, and it will give a big decrease in population. And then the stabilization of the population will be very, very long. There will be a lot of fluctuation and rather violent fluctuation, which will be very difficult to manage in terms of economics and social problems. So, 150 years life expectancy is foolish, of course, but TFR 2.1, same results in terms of structure, but an important increase in population. Because during the moment where we are 85 until the moment 100 years, until the moment we are 105 life expectancy, you have increase in population. And in that case, for example, you could have a drop in fertility for 100 years without damage for the total population. And if you combine the maximum of the distortion, you can combine 150 years of life expectancy and one child per woman, and then you have one consequence is that, contrary to the first scenario, the decrease will start much later, but the decrease will go there. And the age structure of the population would be fantastic, not in the good direction, of course, with 91% of 60 plus, and even 74% of 100 plus. Of course, all these projections are foolish, and probably no one has any chance to be realized. But there are not less chance to be realized than the demographic transition theory. So, my conclusion is that the demographic transition theory was a marvelous tool for the understanding of the past trends and for assuming population post-dates. But it becomes of no use when the TFR reaches the replacement level. Second, more than ever, economic development is crucial for the poorest countries that are still under the pressure of the high population growth. Why it is more than ever? I'll make a parenthesis here. It's because when it was the case for Latin America, or for China, or for North Africa, and so on, population growth was very rapid. India. At that time, the economic situation of the world was rather good. And there are not big pressure from the world economic system of that country, and they could adapt themselves. But now, the poorest countries, which are in the situation, are also dominated by a world economic system which is very, very difficult to them. Okay. Third, everywhere it becomes urgent to prepare societies, our societies, all the societies, to face future drastic population aging. That's absolutely impossible to avoid this aging. And fourth, if quiet demographic future is desired, a lot is to be done in many countries to imagine efficient population policies. But I am not the reset. I am not the key. But it is very urgent to do. Okay. Thank you very much.
Jacques, as soon as I have the ability to ask you a question, first of all, want to say thank you for a very interesting presentation. Thank you. And second, I have only one question. You showed us the very interesting picture with UN project for developing in developed country. Probably I have one alternative explanation the result of comparison. It seems to me that project for developing country is so precision because nobody knows the real population of developing country. It seems to me that the project of developing country is the basis of estimation of population of developing country. I don't know what is the population of China. I don't know exactly the population any big country of Africa. In this situation, I mean that expert of United Nations take the data from last projection as new population estimation. Sorry for this hypothesis. Thank you.
Would you like me to answer right now? To answer? Yes, yes, I understand your your point. Really, it's a good point, but it's not so
simple.
Not so simple. And it is true that the knowledge about demographic trends, demographic indicators is much less in developing countries than in developed countries. But finally, my idea is that it is not so bad as you mentioned. For example, you took the example of China. And it is true that for China, for example, before the census of 1980, there were no census since 1954. And all the work of the United Nations relied on that last census. And with time it was more and more dangerous to make a good appraisal of the real population of China. But the United Nations did what they could do at the time, and they proposed some estimation for China until the next census arrived. And more, the next census were closer. There are a lot of experts said that, United Nations says nothing good. Probably the population of China is much higher, or probably it is much less. And so many estimation was did by others, but United Nations were right. When the census arrived in 1980, it was exactly the result that United Nations estimated before. And this census was controlled, not controlled, but was observed by many experts from the world and from the West, and all experts said that the census was rather confident. So, you see, we don't know what is the mystery for this absence of mistake of the United Nations, but it is like that. And it is also true for many African countries. When there are now censuses in Africa, a lot of countries from sub-Saharan Africa has a series of censuses now, 3, 4 censuses since the starting of the 60s, and it fits rather well with. And when it doesn't fit, we know why it doesn't fit, and we know how much it doesn't fit. For example, for the Nigeria, they did a mass at some point in the time, I don't remember what year exactly, but they measured the census population to have more importance. But in fact, everybody knew that. And also in Gabon, it was the president of Gabon decided by a decree that the census was wrong, so the right figure is that one, more than 1 million, but it was 60,000, 600,000. So I think that you are right, but not completely.
Thank you.
Пожалуйста, еще.
Traditional theory of demographic transition. Меня слышно? Okay. Traditional theory of demographic transition proposed that all countries will come to equilibrium and converge their birth and death rates. And now it's obvious that under the 2.1 fertility, we can observe the divergence, because Southeast Asia is sinking in the demographic abyss. I mean, Hong Kong, Japan, even now China, and in UK and France, fertility almost reached the replacement level, and will reach it soon. You know, how can you explain that? Maybe it's some race matters, because you see that even in the United States, Mongoloid population have lower fertility and lower mortality than European, and the Negroid population have almost always have higher fertility and higher mortality. So, what's your opinion about that?
Yes. So. I have no definite answer to your question. It's a very difficult one. But I think that we could go back to the not demographic transition theory, but demographic revolution theory by Adolphe Landry. And according to Adolphe Landry, the expectation was not to have a stabilization with 2.1 per woman. He was afraid that the fertility rate will get down much more than 2.1. And the reason why he wanted to make this proposal for policies in France. So, and I think that Adolphe Landry was right. The problem is that fertility behavior changes with the change of the society. And what is changing when the society is changed? Changing is in two things. First is the desire for children. People could desire less children because children is something, but there are also other things which are very interesting in the life. So there is a question of desire, and there is a question of ability to fit with the desire. You can have a desire for 2 children, but it is difficult to have 2 children in such and such socio-economic condition. And why are there so much differences between countries? It it is more, I think it is more because of the way, the ability to realize the desire. And the ways are very different from country to country. For example, in the Europe, today, it seems that there is a big difference now between France. You mentioned the United Kingdom, I'm not so sure.
Almost the same situation.
Almost the same. But I don't know exactly the situation in the United Kingdom. But it is true that France is about two children per woman. And most of the surrounding countries are less, 1.4, 1.2, 1.3, I don't know. But perhaps one of the main advantages of France is to be able to give more ability for women to arrange a competition between their career, because now every woman wants to work and to have a good career as a man, of course. But it's difficult when you have children. And in France, the most probably the most important is the advantage meant to the families is not the allowance for children. There are less and less. But probably the fact that school starts very early. We have maternal school, which are very well distributed for all the population. And also the timetable of the primary school, for example, a big difference between France and Germany. The timetable of the primary school is full day in France. In Germany, it's only the morning. So it's very difficult for German women to have children and to have a professional career. And I think that more and more we are going to that direction if we want to have 2 children per woman. It is absolutely necessary to arrange the society to have the women able to have their professional career and the babies. The babies that they probably desire. But this, I'm sure, is an incomplete answer to your question, but I think something there is very important.
Еще вопросы? I wanted to ask, be careful, is it working? Okay. I wanted to ask, what are your thoughts, maybe, on the future development or some projections on health in the developed world? The question is concerning causes of death, actually projections of development. What do you think of it? How it is possible to reach this maximum test of 120, maybe 130, even 150? How it is possible, maybe your thoughts? What do you think of it? Thank you.
Right. There are 2 questions there. First question is, how is it possible for the developing country to reach the maximum observed level right now? And the second is, how it is possible to go to 130, 150? So on the second point, I think that you have already the answer. I don't know. I even not think that it will be the case. 150 is probably out of the wrong. But the first question, you are right to mention it, because we have, for example, we have the experience of Europe. Europe, we had in the Europe a strong convergence in terms of life expectancies until the mid-60s, because at that time the main purpose was to fight against infectious disease. And all the Western, Northern Europe had some advance in that field, but the Mediterranean part of Europe and the eastern part of Europe get more and more efficient in the same field. And finally, they caught up the western and northern countries in the mid-60s. And in the mid-60s, we have a maximum convergence between life expectancy in Europe. But after that, and you know it very well in Russia, of course, you have this big divergence. So the future is never written in advance. Something can happen. And here, what happened is that the fact that in the past communist countries, which were very efficient in terms of infectious disease, failed to go through the new step, which is cardiovascular mortality. And as long as they cannot manage with the mean of fighting against this new range of disease, they have stagnation in life expectancy, and sometimes even worse because of other things. So, for developing countries, it is the same. Right now, not all, but most of them were very efficient to distribute antibiotic, vaccine, and so on, and to fight against infectious disease. But when they arrive at the moment where nothing more can be done in this field of infectious disease, there is a problem. Will they go to the success in terms of cardiovascular or not? Will they pass to another step of the transition? I don't know. But this point is very interesting to study, and it could be a good idea for doctoral dissertation, for example.
Ну что,
in your extreme scenarios, in which year you suppose to reach some extreme parameters, for example, in age childbearing, because only the length of the period to reaching this parameter is important to population dynamics, because shorter period is one and long period another.
Yes. You're right. The timing of the scenario is very important for the results. You are totally right, especially in that scenario with this big fluctuation. If the timing is short, the fluctuation will be very sharp. But I confess to you that I summarized here some results of a study I made with a colleague from Italy, Graziella Caselli, 1 or 2 decades ago. And so I don't remember exactly what was our precise scenario, but it was not to pass immediately to that level of indicators. We arranged for some period of change. For example, for life expectancy of 150 years, we took 100 years for the change. For the change in age, at childbearing, I don't remember, but perhaps it was 20 or 30 years, I don't remember. But in any case, it needs time, of course, but if you shorten the time, you have more dramatic effect.
More questions? Jacques, I have a question. You showed several very extreme scenarios, but what do you think is more plausible from your own viewpoint?
No one. No.
What will happen, say?
No, the less improbable could be one-child perspective. This is not improbable at all, but at the level of countries. At the level of the world, it's difficult. difficult to think of that. But the other scenarios are all foolish. Mean age at childbearing probably never reach 50. But it's just to give an idea of the range of possibilities over the impossible things. And for life expectancy, it's probably right now it's impossible to think really to 150. But it is really possible now to think of 100 or 110, because things are changing so much in biological interventions that it's very possible. And in the future, it's not impossible to think more realistically to extreme hypotheses, but what I don't know. You know that we are going more and more towards the replacement of organs who are failing. We replace hearts. Now we do that in a very rustic way. But in the future, with nanotechnology and so many things, very, very, very small elements of our body, we could do it much more efficiently. And also with genetic therapy, genetic manipulation, we can do many things in the future. Nobody knows about that. Nobody knows now. But what I think is that this field is changing very fast.
One more question. Jacques, you showed that the growth in different parts of the world will be at very different paces. Yeah. And so the population weights of these parts will be dramatically changing. Let me ask you about Africa, a region which you know very well, I think. Thinking about this population growth and about generally very, very difficult situation in this continent from economic and political viewpoints, and about all these boats, you know, trying to cross Mediterranean Sea and to reach Italy or some country. What is your, how actually, is there any way out from this seemingly very difficult situation? Because there is enormous pressure pushing people out, and even, you know, they are doing things which is very dangerous for their life, you know, all these boats. And so, is there any way out? Because it seems that at least this situation is quite urgent now. So what should Europe do, or the world do, to treat it?
You're absolutely right. In fact, when the Europe had some demographic accident, what did they went elsewhere in the world, and nobody impeached them because they were the stronger. So now the situation is the reverse, and especially, as you say, now the most important question is for Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, with very high population growth and very poor economy and so on. And all the frontiers are closed. And my opinion about that, my general opinion about that, is that we are living in a very, very inequitable world. Why? Because we all the powers in the world make an agreement between them to impose to all the world the freedom of trade and the freedom of moving for any things you can sell. But they forbidden completely the move of people. And this is quite imbalanced. And according, because they apply the classical economic theories to the trade, to the industry and so on, but not to the demography. Because in the classical theory, the inequalities between people will change with migration. And what happened in each country with internal migration from the rural to urban, for example, from one region to the other region, produced some equilibrium among people, some, not perfect, of course, but some equilibrium in terms of way of life of everybody inside the country, or inside Europe now. But it is not the case inside the world. And this is a big injustice. Now what we can do? Of course, one country alone cannot do much. Europe can do more, because Europe, in spite of the fact that we have some problems with the euro now, but we are still a strong economy. And I think that we made some mistake about the future by forbidding the entrance of people in Europe, because we would probably be very glad in the future if we would have had a more open attitude. And the United States, from this point of view, are more intelligent than we are in Europe, I think. Of course, there are limitations for immigration, but they allow for some immigration, not few. They allow for very substantive immigration. And they have now a very dynamic population until now. And part of that, they have also a fertility rate of 2.1. But the United States is almost the only country in the developed world that now have a population growth. So we can make some reflection about that. But of course we cannot solve, except if we adopt a rule of the world level, we cannot solve this problem of migration country by country.
No questions? No? Jacques, thank you very, very much for this thoughtful, insightful presentation. And I think we all have something to think about. And thank you very much for coming, for doing that. And all the best for you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was a great pleasure for me to be there with you and to spend these hours with you.